let's begin. Welcome, everybody. My name is Turan Alzadeh, and I am an Associate Professor of Urbanism and Infrastructure at the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. I'm also an ARC Future Fellow and the lead investigator of a multidisciplinary, multi-university project called Infrastructure Governance Incubator, funded by the Henry Halloran Research Trust. Tonight, I'm honored to represent the Trust and welcome you all to this fantastic event. Before we begin with the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigals. It is upon their ancestral land that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our own knowledge, teaching, learning, and research practices within this university, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. With that, I'm pleased to welcome you to the Festival of Urbanism, which is organized by the Henry Halloran Research Trust. Trust is a cross-university center dedicated to fostering new research on cities and regions, and evidence-informed dialogue between researchers, government, industry, and community. The Festival of Urbanism, now in its 10th year, is one of the ways that the Trust promotes this dialogue through our program of public events, which draw on speakers from across academia, government, industry, and community sector. This year's theme is Contested Urbanism, and festival events have ranged from the debates over mega projects to contests over country, such a timely topic, and how we should fix the housing problem. This evening's event on the contest over density, whether Sydney should go up or out, whether high density solves or exacerbates urban health problems, whether you can do density well, and a few more questions like that would have to be one of the most urgent and contentious issues we face in Sydney, but also more broadly across Australia. So, I am delighted to introduce the chair of this evening session, Dr. Elizabeth Farrelly, who is one of the Sydney's leading public intellectuals on cities and urbanism, and the Henry Halloran Research Trust Writer-in-Residence. In case you've forgotten, Elizabeth was for 30 years the Sydney Morning Herald's weekly principal essayist on urban planning and city making, trained in architecture and philosophy with a PhD in urbanism from the University of Sydney. She is a director of the National Trust New South Wales and a former City of Sydney councillor. Author of several published books, she is a Walkley shortlisted writer, and her most recent book is Killing Sydney, The Fight for a City's Soul. Of course, tonight's session is an answer to that very well acclaimed and important book. With that introduction, Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Turan, and thank you everyone for being here. It's lovely to see everybody here. We were here at this time last year launching this project, Saving Sydney, and here we are supposedly at the conclusion of it, although of course I haven't got the writing finished. That's a bit me. Nevertheless, I would like to, first of all, to thank the Henry Halloran Institute Trust, in fact, for the opportunity to be a writer-in-residence for a year and a bit. It's been a lot of fun, and it will go on being fun until I finish this project. I would also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal people, and to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'm conscious in saying that it can sound a bit perfunctory, but I think it is important, especially for those of us in these professions, because the idea of the sacredness of country should be sitting at the bottom of everything we do, in my opinion. So I think it has special significance for us. Saving Sydney is, the written thing is titled something like 7 Ideas to help Sydney be its better self. It is a riposte to Killing Sydney. When I wrote that book in 2021, a lot of people said to me, you know, the Sydney that you like so much, which is the kind of old higgledy-piggledy, messed up, too narrow streets, heavily tree-canopied Sydney. In other words, traditional Sydney, I suppose. But that's not the only bit. Like, there's lots of, even the CBD I'm fond of, although I don't like the term. But people said that Sydney doesn't exist. And I have to say that since I wrote that book, which is about 2.5 years, even less of it exists. And I still feel protective of it. And it's interesting that so much of the argument for destruction that continues to happen is now about affordability and housing supply, the assumption being, of course, that in order to supply housing, in order to drop prices, we have to supply housing, which means that we have to remove all controls, which means we have to build ultra-high density in the way that we're doing it. So part of the purpose of this session tonight is to question a lot of that. One of the reasons my writing project is running a bit late is that I stood for election in between launching and finishing this book, I guess it'll be. And when we were launching our election campaign, our strategist said, you don't worry about it, you just have to think about and be very clear about what are your core values. And I said, well, that's really simple. For me, they're truth, beauty and justice. And she said, don't mention those words. It was almost like, this is Australia, we don't talk about that stuff. So I didn't, but I feel like I can in this room because I reckon you guys will get it. But I was gently shocked by that, of course, but I do think that those values underpin everything that I want us to talk about, I guess, tonight. Justice is about, we're looking at Skyscraper, Fryscraper, the question of whether the tower, which is rampant across Sydney at the moment, you will have noticed that it's not just inner Sydney, it's, Blacktown and Bankstown and Lidcombe and everywhere is suddenly clumped with, in my opinion, very low quality, mostly very low quality towers, not exclusively, I have to say, there are some quite good ones. But there are questions about whether that's the best way to densify Sydney. And the justice thing is about whether they're fair. The beauty thing is whether they're capable of good design. And the truth question, of course, goes to our public debate about these things and the extent to which, in the conversation, such as it is between government, developers, architects and the public, what is the truth content of that conversation, if indeed anything? Is it more than zero? So I find those questions very interesting intellectually, but also very important practically. The assumption that increasing supply will reduce prices and that in order to do that, we have to abandon not just red tape, but green tape, relies on a number of assumptions which are that high density requires high buildings, that increasing supply by rezoning for tall buildings will necessarily lower prices, and that this will all be a blow for equality and for the environment. I think none of those propositions have been demonstrated, and there's quite a lot of counter arguments to contradict them. So I suppose what we're talking about is, are any of those assumptions correct? Does density demand height? Will rampant development actually increase affordability, given that over the last 12 or so years of the biggest building boom we've seen, prices have done nothing but skyrocket. And so therefore are towers a good thing for the environment, for amenity, for social justice, or indeed for anyone? And on the flip side of that, are all dissenters essentially NIMBYs, or is there an honourable way to, and decent and sensible way to discuss all this? So where does truth lie in that conversation? So that's the kind of preamble. And now I would like to introduce our speakers, who are all wonderful, actually, and I'm delighted and honoured that they've all agreed to be here tonight to help with this conversation. Very broad-ranging group of people. First of all, and this is not in any particular order, Professor Kathy Sherry. If you would like to come up as I kind of introduce you. Kathy Sherry is a professor of law and an executive member of Smart Green Cities at Macquarie University. She's a leading international expert in land law with a particular focus on high-density development and an interest in the complex legal, economic and social relationships created by collectively owned land. Her book, which is called Strata Title Property Rights, Private Governance of Multi-Owned Properties, nice cozy title, is very influential and actually quite an interesting read, which is a big thing to say for a law book and a non-lawyer. And she also has an interest which is close to my heart in urban agriculture and food literacy. So that's quite cool. Professor Michael Chapman. I have to apologise for calling you Associate Professor, I think, on social media somewhere recently. Sorry, Michael. Is a Professor of Architecture at University of Western Sydney. Actually, no, Western Sydney University it's called. I always get that wrong. His research, writing and practice focus on a range of subjects: architectural drawing, urbanism, industrialisation, artificial intelligence, and climate change. Michael has won many awards, including the Byron Hadley, and has been exhibited nationally and internationally, including at the Venice Biennale, which is very cool. And he's also engaged actively in architectural practice. Dr. Fiona Fu is a general clinical and interventional cardiologist with extensive experience in interventional cardiology, including, I'm going to try and pronounce all these things properly, coronary angiography, angioplasty and stents. She promotes an active and healthy lifestyle and is also an active member of Doctors for the Environment Australia, and has written a lot about climate change and its importance in heart health, but also in public health as a major factor in public health. She's passionate about international pro bono aid work, especially in Fiji and Nepal. And Tim Sneesby, who's decided to be on his own over there, is a manager strategic planning at Waverley Council. He's always worked closely with developers, and I say that, trying not to sound pejorative. It's not a mean thing to say. In fact, you said it about yourself, Tim. So I suppose working closely with developers is actually a good thing, because I think that's probably an educational process. And I say that quite seriously, including in a Sydney urban economics consultancy and in London as a planner, a former recipient of the Planning Institute of Australia's National Young Planner of the Year Award. Tim also has a keen interest in housing affordability and the relationship of the housing market to planning policy, which of course is absolutely the global topic du jour, so very on theme. All of that said, my first question is for Fiona, because we want to talk about urban heat, and urban heat is a very big issue. It's a particularly big issue in Western Sydney these days. Some of you may be aware of recent work conducted by Associate Professor Sebastian Fauch, again at Western Sydney Uni, who's measured 50 degrees at 6 or 7 places in Penrith in recent summers. So, I mean, that's the kind of heat that kills people. So I wanted, first of all, Fiona, just to ask you about the physiology of extreme heat of that kind and how it affects people, really.
So it's very relevant. Can you hear me? Okay. So very relevant given the recent heat wave we've all kind of experienced. So you've probably already heard, all the headlines from the Northern Hemisphere and the amount of medical conditions it produces. So I like to think of heat in terms of what we call direct effects. So you've got direct effects of heat-related illnesses. So these are things like heat exhaustion, heat stroke. Give you an example, Sydney and the marathon on the weekend. 25 people were taken to hospital, about 40 people were treated by paramedics from essentially heat exhaustion and possibly from heat stroke because they were running in 20-degree heat or even higher, and they were running a marathon. And so it's people like athletes, for example, that can suffer from those things, but also all elderly, young children, pregnant, and people with underlying heart disease and other chronic illnesses, can be at risk of these heat-related illnesses. But essentially anyone can be affected by these, especially when you've got these high temperatures and you can't cool yourself down. So you've got the heat-related illnesses, and then you've got the indirect heat effects, and these are where you get exacerbation of chronic disease. So, for example, if you've got heart disease, you have an increased risk of having a cardiac event, and actually the number one cause of death during a heat wave is actually from a cardiovascular event. Now, I won't go into kind of all the physiology about it, but from a heart point of view, you know, when people, when you're exposed to extreme heat, you need to sweat off that heat, so you have increasing sweat. The body cools itself down by increasing sweat evaporation, and it gets all the blood to the skin and everything dilates. But that reduces the filling of the heart. And then the heart has to work harder, and then if you have underlying heart disease or other illnesses, then you can lead to cardiovascular collapse and having a heart attack. So that is why people who have underlying heart disease are at particularly increased risk of heat. But anyone, young, old, who cannot cool themselves down will also be at risk of these heat-related illnesses. And particularly like in the instance of heat stroke, they present because they can't cool themselves down. Their core temperature is just still so high, and then they can get like stroke-like symptoms. So they get neurological symptoms, they get confusion. It's like they're having a stroke, and that is a medical emergency, and these people need to get to a hospital, and they need to be rapidly called. And you need to think about that, not everyone, think of your neighbours, elderly people, but even people like in sporting groups, outdoor workers. These are all these kind of people that are at risk. And so leading up to we've just experienced this, but leading up to our summer, we need to kind of be mindful of what you can do to prepare yourself to make sure that you don't get too hot, and things like that. So it's everything from drinking lots of water, keeping keeping indoors and keeping shades, closing the windows and things like that. Very simple things. And then from my point of view, if you're on certain medications, they can increase your risk of heat-related illnesses. And having a review of that with your doctor as well.
And just a follow-up, really, about how do you see the sort of social or socio-demographic patterns of that playing out in Sydney? Because I'm conscious that Western Sydney, which is where the bulk of our population lives, is also the hottest part, and also has all of those new suburbs with sort of black roofs that we see pictures of constantly, and no trees, and also has the highest concentration of chronic disease, I think, certainly in Sydney. So that sort of, it seems like a triple or quadruple whammy for those people.
Correct,
right?
yeah. So these people, so definitely Western Sydney have the highest rates of diabetes and obesity. And they're all living, they don't have the dense living, but they're living in houses. There's a lack of trees, so some of the research has been that two streets, there are 20 degrees difference because one has trees and one doesn't. But these people, so they live in housing, they're living in a hot area, but they don't, and they have a lot of chronic disease, and they don't, they drive everywhere, so they don't get the exercise in, then it's too hot for them to exercise. So all of these things kind of exacerbate even more. So you've got a population that are also lower socioeconomically, have more chronic diseases, but they're exposed to more heat. They have lack of, ability to, exercise and do something, they are at increased risk from that. So that is a big thing, and you can see, definitely the demographics in Western Sydney that they're going to they will have more, hospital admissions and all those kind of things because of the chronic illnesses. But with this increased heat in that area, as Elizabeth pointed out, it's unlivable. You can't live in 50-degree heat. Even people, all of us were, sweltering in 30 degrees right? So like it's not, physiologically you cannot live in 50 degrees heat.
Dreadful. Thank you. So, Kathy, Sherry, I'm interested too in the, if you like, the moral aspects of this debate, in particular questions of social equity with regard to strata schemes. You've argued publicly in the paper that the Men's proposal to enlarge developments by 30% as a reward for providing 15% of affordable housing for 15 years is a huge win, but only for developers. Can you tell us why you argued that and what you think about those big strata schemes?
Because it's not going to do anything for the many young people who are sitting in the audience here who probably have reliable incomes, pay their rent regularly and should be able to afford their own house. So affordable housing is a very narrow definition. I think a lot of people in the public think that affordable housing just means that we'll be able to afford to buy housing. That's actually not what it means at all. It's a very narrow tranche of rental housing available for certain people. And it's not going to solve the housing affordability problem. I mean, like a lot of people, I think the key thing is we have to get investors out of the market. And that means you, me, Elizabeth, anyone over the age of 50 should not be buying an apartment as a tax deduction. And we've made a terrible mistake with apartments. So my generation are all hogging your homes because some of us are old enough to remember when developers, when they first pushed apartments in the 1960s, maybe that's too strong a word, but Dick was doing that, always referred to apartments as home units. And the big thing was convincing people that an apartment could be a permanent home, so they were called home units. Somehow in the last 20 years, we've completely lost sight of that, and apartments have become investment vehicles. So it's a way of building wealth, but it invariably means if you build wealth, you are building wealth at the expense of your fellow citizens because housing is a basic human necessity. It's not an optional consumer item, it's a basic necessity. Everybody has to have it. And if you are building wealth out of somebody else's basic necessity, that's going to involve some exploitation. The example I often give to people is, imagine we had tax policies that encouraged some people to stockpile food and then on-sell it at an inflated price. We'd probably think that was morally a bit dodgy. We wouldn't really, it's called profiteering in times of war. You don't want people to do that. And yet that's exactly what we've encouraged with housing. And people have just, en masse, Australians have lost sight of the fact that housing is a basic necessity. And ideally, everybody should be able to own their own house. I mean, it really scares me the way... I think it's really important for things to become better for renters, for residential tenancies to have better conditions, but it scares me the way we're kind of giving up on the idea that young people with reliable incomes could own their own home. And those homes should be apartments, those smaller homes that should be affordable for younger people. And sorry to go back to your original question, the question of building more, that's got nothing to do with providing young people with homes. That's so investors can buy more investment products.
So can you, I don't know if you can enumerate the laws that we'd have to change to enable, what would we have to shift apart from negative gearing to enable that kind of level of ownership, do you think?
I think we need to change. There are lots of things. We need to stop doing first home owners grants, which just drive up the price of housing a corresponding amount. I think we need to change our mindset. I think that's the single biggest thing. So what I see in strata is people who see apartments are investments.
So it's a cultural change.
It's a cultural change. I also do wonder with apartments, it's also a global phenomenon. I do think in the past it was the case that only people who are really rich could own property. Strata apartments mean you chunk large buildings into tiny bits that mums and dads can afford to buy. I do think there is something in the nature of apartments that actually fuels investment markets. But the answer is not just let developers build more. That will, the most obvious thing is no, and I don't understand why the economists don't factor this in. No developer is going to build apartments to flood the market to depress the value of their product. So I was with a whole lot of mates the other day who are
obvious, wouldn't you?
Lawyers, and I said to them, "What are you doing?" This is a law firm that does a lot of really big residential work in Sydney, has done some of the most significant builds. I said, "What are you doing?" They said, "Oh, we're just doing mixed-use stuff." I said, "What about resi?" They said, No, developers are not building because interest rates are going up and construction costs are going up. They are not... The idea that they will flood the market with enough stock to make the price fall is laughable.
So, Tim, I think that goes to you, really, doesn't it? Because you've argued that supply-side solutions to housing affordability are misguided and unlikely to help. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. I feel like you answered the question in a way in your introduction really well. It's just this whole supply-side thinking. It's really just trickle-down economics applied to the housing market. So in the same way that cutting taxes for businesses didn't mean low-income earners got a pay rise, it's the same principle that applies in housing. So, when I came into the profession over 10 years ago, I was just increasingly frustrated by this narrative about supply. And I think it really only started to come out when house prices became unaffordable. So from the booms of the early 2000s and into the 2010s, and so. Every second day there's an article in the mainstream media about we need to increase supply. We need to increase supply. That'll bring down prices. That'll solve the crisis. And I did a LinkedIn post the other day just ranting about it. I often rant about it in articles or on to my colleagues. I'll listen, or to my wife. But the interesting thing about all of these news articles is that they all speak to falling completions, falling approvals, and it's all linked to falling finance because people aren't buying anymore. Okay, and so people aren't buying for a range of reasons. Housing's become unaffordable. Construction costs are incredibly high. Interest rates are now much higher than they were a couple of years ago. So people have stopped buying, and one of the biggest I call it the supply myth. One of the biggest issues is that people don't, or the mainstream media or the politicians don't understand that housing is a build-to-order product. Consumers need to want to buy a house to build a house. It's not a build to sell products like bananas, for example. So the issue is consumers have stopped buying, and you'll find these articles talking about consumers have stopped buying. All of these indicators, finance approvals, completions, etc., have all fallen off. And then in the very next breath, and we need to cut planning controls so that we can increase housing supply. And
right.
I mean, it beggars belief, frankly, that there's no other good or service where you could talk about people have stopped buying bananas. Farmers need to go and grow more bananas.
Yeah.
There's no other product. We use that same logic. So it's incredibly frustrating for planning and simply all of the really good empirical evidence out there, not only in Sydney but all across Australia, and a lot of that's produced by the University of Sydney. Demonstrates that house prices have increased in the last decade and more because of record low interest rates. It's the same story across Australia as in Northern Europe, as in North America. All of these factors have been lower interest rates despite approvals or completions being different rates in those countries. So all of the good empirical evidence has demonstrated that, but unfortunately, it's in the interest of the development lobby to push this idea that we need to solve the housing crisis with supply, and that's helped along by supply-side economists like the RBA, for example. The sort of, and frankly, neoliberal economics is sort of that's the hegemony in our society. So, so they're pushing that angle. And unfortunately, what that's meant is that politicians at all different levels are now pushing that argument. Frankly, there's probably only two planning ministers, Rob Stokes and Bob Carr, were probably the only two that didn't buy that argument.
So you think they actually believe it? Because it seems implausible, doesn't it? Or they just was it just a stroke of genius on the part of the PR firm employed by the development lobby?
I think it's very convenient for state government and federal government politicians to push that line, because what it means is it comes down to councils. And it's the council planners that are holding up supply, and they're the problem. It's not the negative gearing, it's not the taxation settings, it's not the capital gains tax of the federal level. It's not the state government not intervening and providing social and affordable housing, which they should be doing. So they can wipe their hands clean of those arguments, which would actually help by pointing the finger at councils, by pointing the finger at the planning system.
So you work for Waverley, which has a number of very fine towers lined up along the ridge there at Bondi Junction. What's your view of whether we need high rise to sort out high density or medium high density?
Yeah, it's a good question. So for those that don't know, Bondi Junction, there sort of has 10 to 12 storey towers in Bondi Junction, but I like to draw the analogy, of the fact that we don't need high rise to have high density. And the analogy I draw in my LGA, for example, is I point to Bondi Junction with its towers, and then I point to the neighbouring suburb of Mill Hill, which has terraces, and then I point to Bondi Beach, which has the classic 4-pack, 2 up, 2 down apartments. Each of those different typologies has the same dwelling density. And so that's what I like to point to, and I think it speaks to this idea of the missing middle, which we've been speaking to for about a decade now. That all of the good urbanists are out there preaching the missing middle, and so I think that's something that us planners would like to see more of. I think it's very challenging to retrofit the missing middle in our cities, and so that's why we see, for example, an unholy alliance between Save Our Suburbs and the Urban Task Force, who want more towers in and around stations, because it's very difficult to retrofit things like terraces or 4-pack type apartments in the suburbs. It's much easier for the larger developers to argue for windfall gains around stations. So.
Yes, always good to argue for windfall gains and developers' land. Michael Chapman, I would like to ask you what we're going to do about this. But no, look, you're the one that has to come up with the solution. No, actually, what I want to ask you about is what's your view of this high-rise debate as an architect and someone who's recently moved to Sydney, and I think you said you're living in or have bought into a high-rise apartment tower, is that right? So perhaps that gives you a conflict of interest, but or perhaps not. So just interested in your view of all this.
Yeah, no, I think that all of those things are actually true, that I have recently given up quite an idyllic existence on a leafy street close to a park, a block from the beach, in a city with a very pleasant morphology, primarily because Newcastle was mined, and underneath Newcastle, huge kind of layer of tunnels, which made it very difficult to build tall buildings. And when I moved to Sydney, and I came here because I'm interested in the Western Sydney project and all of the complexity of that, and wanting to teach the kind of students that are engaged in that and are coming out of those environments. But I wanted to buy the smallest piece of residential accommodation I could that was close to nature, allowed me to ride a bike to university, and I wanted to be amongst a diverse, multicultural, highly layered and multi-generational environment. And my environment that I'm living in is absolutely stimulating in sense of that never been more close to a broader range of types of living, which wasn't necessarily something I expected. But having said that, I live in a suburb where, the community centre is built by a developer, the bridge is built by a developer, the buses are run by developers. The shape of the environment is actually driven by decisions made primarily through capitalism, because councils or whatever have maybe given up being able to provide those services, and the market is moving in and actually deciding what a city is like. My faith or my optimism in that is that people have moved in and have actually created environments out of that. And from my perspective as an agent of architecture or an advocate for architecture, I absolutely believe in the quality of good design, and the more people that can live in well-designed environments is, for me, the most important thing that architects can do is increase the number of people that get the opportunity to live in those environments. And rather than doing expensive houses in beautiful sites, I think the generation of architects I'm teaching won't be building big projects, they'll actually be modifying the projects that exist. So for me, the potential is not in what because I don't think we'll be building big projects like this with the issues of carbon and climate and all of those things in 10 years' time. So what are the opportunities for architects to actually have a bigger involvement, more autonomy, and provide better opportunities for more people? And in Western Sydney, I think that's a really big question, because, there is no doubt that the cost of providing design is a factor. It increases dramatically the availability of it.
Yes, and I'm interested, when you when you bring apartments together, any kind of dwelling, of course, it applies to, but I'm curious about not just the dwellings themselves, but what kinds of streets and communities they make when they're kind of agglomerated together, and whether there are things we should be doing differently. In particular, I suppose, whether there are things that should be differently regulated in order to improve either the dwelling quality or the quality of the streets that result, and the streets and neighbourhoods, I guess, that result.
Yeah, no, I definitely think regulation, and obviously there's a lot of planning history to it, but it affects environments in really absolute ways, and if you look at, I'm very drawn to Asian cities, but the absence of regulation and allowing people to do so many different things creates these incredibly interesting environments. But one of the ones, like the missing middle debate, I think is quite interesting, but the conversation about the size of the apartment that you live in and the quality of that apartment and how much agency you have over it, I think needs to come into that debate. Like the house that I live in Cooks Hill is half the size of the smallest apartment I could find to buy. And I think if I could buy something half that size, and I live in a west-facing apartment with all of those issues of heat, but it forces me at 3 o'clock in the afternoon to take my dog down to the river with my laptop and get outside of my apartment. And even if it's through bad design, if an architect can get you outside in a natural environment, it's a good outcome for everyone.
Bad design is good design.
Bad design.
Yes, I like this. So does that mean we should be regulating less or more? Or different?
I think councils need to reclaim the space that the public level of the ground and the city belongs to the people. It doesn't belong to developer interest. And it shouldn't be fueled by commercial, it shouldn't be wealthy restaurants, and it actually is a socialist collective, and as soon as you give that up, you give up the idea of the city, really.
Doesn't the idea of affordable space at street level suggest that we have to keep heights down in order to keep property prices down, in order to keep rents reasonable? If you're going with capitalism, I guess.
Yeah.
Don't you think?
I do think that, I'm of the view that density does create, the more of the natural environment we can preserve, the better. And I'm also aware of large amounts of Sydney that are covered with very mediocre medium density housing that is almost devoid of natural kind of qualities. So being precise, I think, and being deliberate. But if you're an architect working on a high-rise building, if you make a mistake, even a slight mistake, you're often repeating that 300 or 400 times. And and so regulation is trying to force a basic level of behaviour. But if you're doing something well, you're also creating a much better outcome. So I'm drawn to cities like Madrid and Paris, and obviously the sort of 8-storey kind of type cities, but Madrid's also an incredibly hot city in the summer because of all of those concrete surfaces, and it's really the parks that actually... So I guess what I'm actually advocating for is natural environments and opportunities for architects to get, or for people to get out of, not sit in their apartment, but actually go out into the world and actually live more of their life as a community.
Yeah. Interesting. I'm sure this conversation could run for some time, but I'm going to ask if anyone on the floor has a question or comment at this point. Question, ideally, for... Yes.
Hi there, Nicole Dennis. I'm an urban planner. I've got a question for Tim in council. Some of the work I've done years ago, working on planning side and getting new subdivisions through Blacktown, Liverpool, in Western Sydney. We had, this was a big learning experience for me, we had a lot of pushback from council. They couldn't afford to put in many street trees. We tried to value add with better water sensitive urban design, additional trees. The developer was happy to create better streets with more trees, more greening. We connected with all the researchers. They had their pilot program. But at the end of the day, the engineering department was worried about their ongoing budget and had a huge challenge with the amount of growth in infrastructure that those councils have. And we know with the additional infrastructure charges in terms of SIC and contributions, and also Sydney Water struggling to provide infrastructure, and we've got the 4-year transition of those charges. I just wanted to hear from council's perspective where that conversation lies. I know there's tension with state, but there is the challenge that often, just an observation that some developers, particularly when they can create a larger community, they are controlling that public space in the parks because they see that as part of their product. Just interesting thoughts from you or the rest of the panel. I think it's a pretty big challenge that stakeholders across that are trying to do in terms of Western Sydney.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Nicole, and good to see you after all these years. Blacktown's probably almost the opposite of Waverley, so I'll, in terms of LGAs, but it's very, the infrastructure contributions and the infrastructure challenge and coordinating that with land use, it's probably the major issue in urban planning. And frankly, the issue being that historically land would be rezoned without a development contributions framework in place. And so that would create all sorts of problems, and frankly, councils would often take years to develop that, as well as the state government with the SICs, the state infrastructure contributions, which is now actually why we've got the housing and productivity contribution, for those planning nerds playing out there. So it's a huge challenge to try to line those up. Councils often aren't as responsive as they could be with providing infrastructure. But it's also a challenge to get things like, trees as an example. It's very challenging. That was there was almost a conscious of being recorded, but that was a major challenge as a part of our last DCP that went to council. Incredibly contentious. Trees are incredibly contentious in established communities anyway, especially ones with views. So as we've probably seen in the media in the last couple of weeks. So, I know, for example, out of Wilton, they had a DCP where they wanted one mature tree in each lot, for example, and that was created a lot of debate at the time, which is sort of, we talk about 50 degree heat out in the suburbs, and we know the benefits of canopy cover. So I'm not sure I answered your question. I went off on a tangent on trees, but there's challenges on both sides in terms of councils implementing infrastructure, but also getting that.
Kathy, did you want to say something too about that?
I just wanted to say one of the risks is the kind of developments I specialise in. When you say developers think it's their domain, very often it is, because the alternative to councils funding it is community title, which is just flattened out strata. So very often in Sydney now, when you're looking at what you think is public space, it's not public space at all. So Central Park down the road from here, that central bit of that when you go to the restaurants, that's not publicly owned space at all. It's privately owned, private property. It belongs to the development itself. So it's either stratum subdivision, which is a complex form of strata with building management statements. I promise I won't go into any detail. Or it's community title, which is like Breakfast Point. So everything looks as though it's public, but it is as much private property as my backyard is private property. And it means that the people who live there have responsibility for paying to maintain it. They often don't realise when they buy in, they have to insure it, although the public has access to it. And they can also regulate it. So somewhere like Liberty Grove, it's the former Olympic site. It has a privately written bylaw that says children under the age of 13 are not allowed to be on common property without a resident adult above the age of 21, which is just wrong in so many ways. 21 not being of any relevance, whatever, today. But the planning approval said you had to have this open space, but the private bodies corporate have come over the top and created privately enforceable regulation that says a bunch of 12-year-olds can't shoot hoops at the basketball court unless they are with a resident over the age of 21, so not grandma and not their older sister who's 19 or 15.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
So that's,
and there's also the question of private dominance of public space, and I'm thinking of the very dense development currently under construction in Marrickville that you might know, which is on the north side of quite a small public park and totally overshadowing it and sort of owning it in not in fact but in effect, really, which I think is also a serious issue. Anyway, so are there more questions? Yes.
I'm Melina Rowan, a sustainability built environment specialist person who's interested in these things. There are a lot of office buildings and B, C, D grade buildings at the moment that are around which are not being used. What is the panel's view on the ability to perhaps convert those into housing? What are the challenges, what are the opportunities, and how can they be done in an environmentally effective way?
This is your PhD topic. Who would like to have a go at that?
Oh, not me.
Tim.
I'll start if that's okay. It's a very good question and certainly something that's been doing the rounds in the media from time to time. Might have been a thought bubble from the Productivity Commissioner at one stage in New South Wales. It's challenging in a couple of ways because it assumes that only 2 years after COVID, where we are now, is going to be the future forever more. So as a planner, I'm very big on the precautionary principle and thinking long term. I'd like to see a bit more space between COVID and the effects of that and vacant offices. I mean, it could be a long-term trend, but I'd like to see a little bit more space in terms of strategic planning before we go and make a decision which is irreversible. Because once you stride these office buildings, they're gone forever. So for me, the precautionary principle comes to mind. I wouldn't like to do it until at least a few more years to understand whether we think, no, that's going to be a long-term challenge. We know there are issues with retrofitting old office buildings in terms of the floor plates are often very deep and very large, and in terms of trying to meet the 80, like the SEP 65 apartment design guides, in terms of sunlight penetration and of course ventilation too. So that is a physical challenge, and frankly, it really comes back to the supply issue. And one of the ostensible reasons for doing this and converting this is that it would really help with supply. And frankly, it would be an amazing location for housing. Like, being in the city, it's the best location. But I don't think it would do anything in terms of bringing house prices down or bringing rents down.
Which presumably essentially requires government intervention of some kind. Sorry, Michael, you want to say something?
No, I mean, it made me think of a project which I think is in Venezuela. They built this high-rise in the 1980s, and I think the developer banker died at the wrong time, and it stayed as this unfinished thing. But then squatters just kind of moved in and actually turned it into this amazing environment. And when I talk about deregulation or the way a lot of Asian cities, if no one's using it, then let someone use it. But my experience of living in very dense environments is it's constantly about negotiating your privacy with about 5 or 6 other people that I live in very close proximity to. But when you realise that's a conversation and that you can share and you can give some of your space back in order to retain some of your own privacy, you actually have a very different way of thinking about living in the city as opposed to just living, on a block in a house like I used to. So yeah, I would be. I know it's very different to the way a council or someone might think of it, but I would think if no one's using it, then why not let someone use it? Who's going to get hurt?
That would be cultural change, yes.
I was going to say, Elizabeth, I am available for squatting advice. It's legal.
Excellent, there should be more of it, yes.
G'day, my name's George Papanicolo. I'm not a representative of any organisation, so I'll just call myself a concerned private citizen. I got a bit late, so I don't know if you've touched upon this directly, although indirectly with some of the issues you've mentioned. Anglicare just released a report in the last week or two about the cost of poverty, which basically indicated that poor people actually have more costs to pay often than people in more well-off areas in terms of insurance, extra transport costs, fuel costs, so many others that I won't go into now. Look it up. But basically, can you use that kind of report, because it hasn't really made much of a splash, which I'm surprised at, to leverage more support for building, environmentally and energy efficient housing developments, which are more cost beneficial to the people who live there, because it's not just enough to actually rent or buy a place. You have to actually maintain it and pay for your bills. I mean, the only thing in the wealthy suburbs probably that compensates the higher rates, but everything else, as according to this report, even the cost of food in supermarkets can be higher. So I'm just wondering whether you think that's a possibility, because I worry about, and you mentioned Liberty Grove, which I know quite well, we could possibly end up with this idea of, gated communities with rich, mainly white people, who surrounded by very high fences and private security and security guards. And some of these private communities have private roads, so they actually have legal rights to actually stop people from going in. This is something that's been very common in places like LA. So I'm just wondering whether, if we don't do that, apart from all the health costs for people living there, whether this will cause much social disruption in the near future. I don't think it's that far away, actually.
Is that question to someone in particular, Kathy?
Well, no, it's a very timely question. I've been thinking, or I've had conversations with students in Western Sydney about exactly this, particularly there's a lot of uncertainties in terms of climate and all of these things, but the one thing that is certain is we know where the sun will be. We know how certain materials like thermal mass can store that energy. And if you face them the right way, and this was known when I was a student, it was... and I guess the other thing about Western Sydney is it's very hot, but it also gets very, very cold, considerably more cold than what we have here. So just designing those, the basic kind of rules of design, which don't seem to occur in a lot of developer-driven housing for whatever reason, and probably a lot to do with the way that land is petitioned and various things. But I was saying to my students, if you can reduce the energy bills for a family in a low socioeconomic environment, you're doing more. And we know that those bills are going to get more, and these are things we can actually control. It doesn't cost more necessarily to design something well. So in terms of, I think we can leverage it. I don't know how to leverage, or I don't quite have the levers to actually roll out much better housing, but I think it's a very important question, and I want my students to have the confidence to sit in meetings and actually say, well, it doesn't have to be this way. There are simple things we can do here that can have big income, can have big effects, or small effects for people that would actually appreciate it. So. But that's more of a comment. I think it's a very timely conversation, particularly in Western Sydney. Big effects for people who haven't got a lot of incomes. Yeah.
There's a question, I think, over the side.
Good evening. I've enjoyed living in apartments. One thing that's really bugged me is the inability to dry my clothes on the balcony, often due to strata rules. But I'm also interested in the health implications of running a dryer constantly inside your house.
Yeah. You're going to be horrified to hear this, but I actually wrote a PhD on strata bylaws because what I'm actually really interested in is the way in which strata title gives private citizens the power to write laws for their neighbours, and what are civil liberties makes me sound like a libertarian. I'm not, obviously, but there's a basic thing that the whole point of home and why it matters to us is it's a place in which we can be ourselves, live our lives according to our own values. You don't have to be a neoliberal or a libertarian to think that matters. I think matters to all of us. And so strata bylaws are extraordinary. Under the legislation, you can write a bylaw that will be valid so long as it relates to the use of a lot or common property. Common property is the hallways, but the lot is your apartment. Just has to relate to the use or enjoyment of your lot. A bylaw banning people eating meat in their own apartment is prima facie valid. It's extraordinary. The legislation's so badly drafted, and a classic example would be, banning people having pets who have no effect on anyone else, but also banning people drying things on their balcony, which can sometimes be common property. But that has an effect on the enjoyment of your life, your autonomy, but also obviously it has an effect on the environment, and that's a huge thing which I think governments have not got their heads around. If you let private citizens write rules, that has an effect on the rest of society, and this usually horrifies people, but the easiest example for this is racially restrictive covenants in the United States, endemic. Developers throughout the 20th century allowed to do residential subdivisions that have a rule on them that says only Caucasian people can live on or buy this land. Clearly that does not just affect the immediate parties to the transaction, the people who buy and sell the land. It affects the entire society and has ongoing effects in America. We have never had those in Australia, different things, but not those. But clearly when you allow private citizens to write rules that potentially regulate large amounts of land, and that's what a strata scheme is, and also when they're replicated across the city, it's large amounts of land, you're essentially allowing private citizens to write legislation and create the kind of societies we may not want to live in, going back to your point about, yes, about gated communities. These are mini societies made in accordance with particular values that may not be consistent with the rest of the community, i.e. we care about climate change and we don't want people using dryers unnecessarily.
I'm going to have to stop us there. I'm sorry. I'm going to ask everyone to have a 10-second go at what you would change in the world of Sydney planning and city making if you could change one thing, but in sort of 6 words or fewer, if you can. Maybe 10. Tim, would you like to go? Do you have a wish?
I would say that the biggest problem we face in urban planning is policy capture. It's policy capture by industry, and if we had less of that and we had more strategic planning done by communities and governments in partnership, then we would see better outcomes. We would see, I think, more green squares and more Piermonts and less of these 30-storey type towers, all around Sydney. I think that's that's a product of policy capture in the urban planning system.
Good. Fiona?
So big thing, green and blue spaces. We just need more greenery, trees everywhere on all the streets, on all the buildings. There's that building I drove past today that's just covered in green. So yes, you can have high rises, but there should be green everywhere. And everywhere should have light roofs with solar panels. We just all have to transition to renewable energy. And talking about poverty, and we had this conversation with the Minister for Bankstown area. Anyway, I can't remember. But he was saying, so a lot of my clients can't afford, so a lot of the people cannot afford solar panels. And, that's when, government have to kind of step in to kind of say, we need to be transitioning people who can put solar panels on there to help them afford solar panels. And then also, get off the grid, but also have community storage batteries and things as well. But the whole green spaces and blue spaces, because that's going to reduce urban heat.
It's huge.
Exactly. It's huge, yeah. And it's got, health benefits. Going to the park, doing exercise, mentally, and physically, yeah.
Michael?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that, actually. I guess if I would say the more we can involve architecture and design to more people, and also the more we can open up the urban realm to the community and have a participatory urban realm where everyone is feeling some ownership and actually being a part of it, I think, but certainly the proximity to nature and the access to good environments.
Yep.
Housing's a basic human necessity. It's not an asset for building wealth.
A basic right. Housing is a human right.
Just basic for survival.
We have run out of time. I'm so sorry. This conversation could run and run. I hope everybody will stay around for half an hour or so and have a drink and a chat. And I would like to thank everybody. And I need to hand over to Turan. Sorry. Sorry, I know we're over time, but thank you to the panel so much.
All I can say is thank you to Elizabeth, thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you for all of you to making the time and making this a priority and showing up, because I think that's the first thing that we need to do as concerned citizens, to show up. So please keep showing up for the rest of Festival of Urbanism events, because this is one of the best and few avenues that we have to hear from true experts and not necessarily get confused with all of the noises that are around us. If you have time, please stay around for a bit of reception, and hopefully we can continue the conversation in a more informal, relaxed environment. Thanks again. Thank you, everyone.